forests of the Ardennes region of southern Belgium were the focus of Hitler's spectacular invasion in 1940. The invasion culminated in the fall of France and Nazi domination of Western Europe. 4.5 years later, 83,000 American troops swept across France and took control of the Ardennes sector. Convinced that the war was almost over, they relaxed and looked forward to a peaceful Christmas. But shortly before dawn, on December 16, 1944, the American GIs were pulverized by a massive German artillery bombardment of 2,000 guns. At 5:30 a.m., German assault groups composed of 275,000 men and over 2,000 panzers rolled forward. The German Ardennes counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. It was Hitler's last great gamble in the West. He wanted to split the Anglo-American forces and end their advance into Germany. If the gamble failed, Germany would lose the best of its remaining armed forces and expose itself to defeat on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower would rely heavily on General Omar Bradley to frustrate the Germans, while Hitler expected Field Marshal Walter Model to strike a decisive blow. The result was a momentous clash of warriors. The Allied breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944 and the subsequent advance across Northwest Europe at first gave Allied commanders confidence that Germany was on the verge of collapse. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, was certain that the road to Berlin was open. In contrast, Field Marshal Walter Model, who succeeded Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge as Commander-in-Chief West, now stared defeat in the face. He had inherited a dispirited, depleted, and utterly disorganized army. German soldiers were either surrendering in droves or were in retreat. But the pace of the Allied advance then slowed. British General Bernard Montgomery pressed for a rapid drive aimed at the Ruhr, while U.S. General George Patton argued for a swift advance through the coal-rich Saar region and into Germany's heartland. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was more pragmatic and preferred two simultaneous thrusts. But the Allies had a major problem. Their supply lines still ran from Normandy and were dangerously stretched. Supply convoys known as the Red Ball Express had to drive around the clock to reach the front lines and were in danger of consuming as much fuel as they carried. This crisis should have been relieved by Britain's seizure of the Belgian port of Antwerp on September 4th. But Montgomery failed to secure the Schelde estuary, which meant that Allied ships could not reach the port. Instead, a daring airborne operation was mounted. Launched on September 17th, the operation's purpose was to secure bridges over key waterways in Holland before outflanking the River Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier in the west. But the failure of this operation, combined with Allied supply problems, slowed the advance toward Germany. It would not be until the end of November that the Schelde estuary was cleared, which enabled heavy cargo to enter Antwerp. But by then, the momentum of the Allied advance had slowed. Bradley's men inched toward the German border during the autumn of 1944. On the German side, Hitler reappointed Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West in the early autumn. Consequently, Field Marshal Model was given command of Army Group B. He now took maximum advantage of the Allied supply problems. The stalled Allied advance allowed the German army to recover from the disasters of the summer. The Germans called this the miracle in the West. The Allies then encountered bitter resistance as they crossed the German border, notably in the battle for Aachen and the prolonged fighting in Hürtgen Forest. Eisenhower now saw that there was no hope of ending the war in Europe before the end of 1944. Worse, Adolf Hitler was about to launch a major counteroffensive. It would target the American sector manned by Bradley's U.S. 12th Army Group in the forests of the Ardennes region. The offensive would bring General Bradley and Field Marshal Model into direct confrontation. Omar Nelson Bradley was born in Missouri in 1893, the son of a school teacher. His father died when Omar was just 14. Bradley attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1911, where he was a classmate of Eisenhower. Both graduated with distinction in 1915. Bradley joined the infantry, but during World War I, he commanded an infantry company stateside. In 1920, Omar Bradley returned to West Point as an instructor in mathematics. From 1924 to 1934, he was given infantry command and staff posts. He was promoted ahead of many of his peers. As a major in 1930, Bradley was an instructor at the U.S. Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia. A fellow instructor there was Lieutenant Colonel George C. Marshall, who later became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in World War II, and a great influence in Bradley's later career. By early 1941, Bradley had become commandant of Fort Benning. When the U.S. entered World War II after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Bradley was commanding an infantry division and was ready for action. Brigadier General Bradley's chance came in mid-1942. He was appointed to Eisenhower's staff to plan the Operation Torch landings in Northwest Africa that November. During the later Tunisian campaign, he was deputy, then commander of the U.S. Second Corps. Major General Bradley's Second Corps then took Bizerta in May 1943 at the end of the campaign. He led the Second Corps during the invasion of Sicily the following July. Bradley's skill as a Corps commander was rewarded with an appointment to lead the U.S. First Army during the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. Within hours of the successful Allied landings on June 6, 1944, Bradley was on shore, leading his men. The U.S. First Army then advanced into Normandy and fought through the difficult and heavily defended countryside. On August 1st, Bradley became head of the U.S. 12th Army Group, which included his former First Army and Patton's newly arrived Third Army. By mid-December 1944, Omar Bradley was preoccupied with breaking the stalemate. He planned for a decisive final offensive to be launched in early 1945. Walter Model was born in Magdeburg in 1891, the son of an impoverished music teacher. He joined the German Army in 1908 as an officer cadet. At age 19, Model graduated from the Cadet Academy as a lieutenant. During World War I, he served on the Western Front as an infantry officer and on the German General Staff. Model was severely wounded twice and was highly decorated for his courage and leadership in battle. After the war, he remained in the German army. By 1932, he had become a lieutenant colonel. Model was not a disciple of Hitler's Nazi regime, but he recognized Germany's opportunity to assert its military authority on the rest of Europe, especially France. In 1934, Colonel Walter Model took command of an infantry regiment. Appointed a senior staff officer a year later, he was instrumental in shaping the ideas of the Blitzkrieg into a doctrine for warfare. He became Chief of Staff of the 4th Corps, in which he served during the 1939 Polish campaign. In May 1940, Model was Chief of Staff of the 16th Army for the German attack on France and the Low Countries. In 1941, he was now a lieutenant general. Model commanded a panzer division, then a panzer corps during the invasion of Russia. It was on the Eastern Front that he earned his reputation as a master of mobile defense. He was soon nicknamed Hitler's fireman. Model took over the German 9th Army when the Russians prepared a counteroffensive. Asked what he brought to restore the situation, he replied, "Myself. The Russian attack was held." The 9th Army suffered heavy losses during the German offensive on Kursk in July 1943. But as the German Army's fate in the East worsened, Hitler became increasingly dependent on Model's defensive skills and loyalty. Model's reliability won him Hitler's admiration. Model became the youngest field marshal in the German Army in March 1944. In August, Hitler witnessed the collapse of German defenses in the West. He called on Model once more. Between September and December 1944, Model restored the defensive line in the West. He then planned to go on the offensive. Model and Bradley would soon face the greatest challenge of their careers. By early December 1944, Eisenhower and his commanders realized that the Allied advance to the River Rhine would take time, but they remained optimistic. Allied intelligence staff believed the German forces in the West were suffering 9,000 casualties per day. Eisenhower and his subordinates agreed that despite its fierce resistance, the German army was on the brink of collapse. Montgomery's staff also concluded that the Germans could not possibly stage a major offensive. But Montgomery was still devoted to a narrow front strategy, with the Allies concentrating their resources in a single thrust into the Ruhr. Bradley, on the other hand, supported Eisenhower's policy of advancing along a broad front. As a result, the Ardennes became the center of an unfortunate compromise. Eisenhower temporarily solved the problem by decreeing that the Allies would close up the River Rhine by attacking on both sides of the Ardennes in early 1945. By early December 1944, the Allied front line was over 200 miles long, so Eisenhower decided to thin out his forces in the 85-mile central sector of the Ardennes. It was held by 83,000 GIs from Bradley's 12th Army Group. Mainly infantry units, they had either just arrived from the U.S. and had not seen action, or were resting after fighting in the Hürtgen Forest in the north. Bradley had 250 Sherman tanks, armed with a 75mm gun. They were effective against the German Panzer Mark IV, but no match for the more heavily armed Panther and Tiger tanks. He also had almost 500 artillery pieces. The Allies enjoyed air supremacy over the Western Front, but the planes would be grounded in poor weather. Holding the Ardennes with so few troops was, in Bradley's view, a calculated risk. One of his corps commanders feared a German attack. But based on his own intelligence assessments, Bradley agreed with the overall Allied view. Unwittingly, Bradley and his colleagues had become reliant on information from the top-secret German Enigma machine that was decoded at Bletchley Park, England. But the decryptions provided little information confirming a German offensive, principally because Hitler imposed a radio blackout. Allied commanders assumed a mood of dangerous complacency. As early as August 19, 1944, Hitler and his closest staff members had begun planning what would become the Ardennes offensive. It was a characteristic gamble by Hitler. The German army had lost hundreds of its precious panzers and suffered over 500,000 casualties in August alone. But Hitler knew about the Allies' disagreement over strategy. He toyed with the idea of a surprise counteroffensive in the West, to split the Allies and cause the coalition to collapse. By early September, the Germans were stabilizing the front in the West. On the 16th, Hitler and his commanders met to discuss the Western and Eastern fronts. Hitler told his astonished audience that an overwhelming armored thrust would split the Allies by thrusting toward Antwerp. To help achieve surprise, it would be launched from the forest of the Ardennes. But Allied bombing of German synthetic oil plants had ensured that Hitler's offensive would only get a quarter of its minimum fuel requirements. That meant that Model's offensive had to overrun American fuel depots to replenish his panzers. If he failed, Germany's tanks would run dry. Hitler assured Model that he would be an unstoppable force. But Model bitterly opposed the idea. Instead, he and von Rundstedt proposed a more modest alternative, a pincer movement around Aachen to trap Bradley's forces against the Meuse. It became known as the small solution, but Hitler would have none of it. Therefore, Model believed that his only chance of success would be in achieving total surprise. The offensive was set for December 16, 1944. The main thrust would go through the Ardennes and then swing northwest toward Antwerp. Model had 24 divisions for the task, of which 10 were armored. A total of over 275,000 men were organized in 3 armies. SS General Sepp Dietrich and his 6th Panzer Army would attack from the north. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the center and was to capture the town of St. Vith, cross the River Our, and support Dietrich's advance. General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army was to protect von Manteuffel's left flank as he advanced. The German offensive would include 2,600 armored vehicles, including the Mark VI Tiger, the Mark V Panther, and self-propelled assault guns. On Hitler's instructions, Model had collected 2,000 artillery pieces to carry out a devastating preliminary bombardment and support the armored thrusts. Model also had over 2,000 aircraft, but not enough to combat the Allies' overwhelming air supremacy. Model relied heavily on deception. The code name for the attack was Watch on the Rhine. Disinformation was purposely leaked, Together, this suggested to the Allies that the German activity was purely defensive. Both the 6th and 5th Panzer armies were concentrated away from where the attack would be staged, again deceiving the Allies. Hitler banned radio communications about the forthcoming attack. Instead, messages were delivered by couriers escorted by Gestapo agents. For the final concentration of the troops at the front, German staff officers orchestrated a 3-day forward movement. The troops moved only at night. By day, they hid in the forests. A special operation, codenamed Condor, completed the deception. English-speaking commandos wearing U.S. uniforms would carry out acts of sabotage in the American rear areas. Condor was the brainchild of Colonel Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's commando extraordinaire. As mid-December loomed, it was clear that the morale and quality of the troops on both sides would play a crucial role in the outcome of the conflict. Since D-Day, the Allies had been fighting a hard and bitter campaign to advance toward the borders of Hitler's Germany. But by early December 1944, Bradley's U.S. troops in the Ardennes sector of France felt that the war was far away from them. The troops were mainly greenhorns, with some veterans of recent fighting. They were known as the American Army's nursery and old folks' home. Over 80% of the Allied casualties since D-Day had been infantrymen. This left the infantry units desperately short of manpower, especially experienced officers. The recent replacements had yet to face their first test in battle. Even so, morale was generally high among the Allied troops. In mid-December 1944, many of Bradley's men were in a holiday mood, winding down for what they expected to be a peaceful Christmas. Heavy losses had forced the Germans to restructure their infantry units in 1944. Hitler had created Volksgrenadier divisions, which recruited 16 and 17-year-olds. Others came from the Luftwaffe and Navy. Most were hastily trained and knew little about infantry tactics. However, for most German troops under Field Marshal Model, the situation had improved dramatically since the miracle in the West in October 1944. They had fought back with great professionalism and courage. They had achieved the impossible and made the Allies pay dearly for every yard that they advanced. Now the Germans were poised to attack again. Their morale was high. Hitler and Model were also using some of the veteran elite units to guarantee success, especially the ruthless SS. They had already demonstrated their ruthlessness during the fighting in Normandy, especially in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, where most of the inhabitants were massacred. Model also had paratroopers and the crack Wehrmacht panzer divisions of von Manteuffel's 5th Army. Their confidence remained high, for they knew the German Panther and Tiger tanks were superior to the American Sherman tank. Despite Model's personal reservations over Hitler's plan, his men were convinced they would beat the American troops and cross the Meuse as planned. On the evening of December 15, 1944, the German troops began to move forward to their attack positions. On the western side of the Ardennes forest, Bradley's GIs were oblivious to the growing threat. the unwitting Omar Bradley and resolute Walter Model would soon meet in a bloody and desperate struggle. Shortly before dawn, on December 16, 1944, a massive German bombardment stunned, then overwhelmed U.S. troops facing the Ardennes region of France. At 5:30 a.m., the first German troops emerged from the impenetrable mist. At first, there was panic in the American lines. In the center, the U.S. 28th Division was quickly overrun. In the north, some of the 106th Division was cut off. But some isolated units held their ground, denying the Germans an early breakthrough to the River Meuse. In the north, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army was blocked by Bradley's men from the 99th Division. Faced with tougher opposition than anticipated, Dietrich decided to push one of his divisions south, where the Americans seemed to present an easier target. The Germans broke through on a 5-mile front to outflank Bradley's defenders. They moved around the Schnee Eifel, a salient of small villages and forest-covered hills. In the center, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was making better progress. On December 16th, his panzers crossed temporary bridges over the River Our. A breakthrough pushed toward the town of Bastogne. It was soon clear to Model that the capture of Bastogne would be vital to the success of the German offensive. At his headquarters, 30 miles from the action, Bradley failed to appreciate the scale of Model's offensive. He initially thought it was a spoiling attack. But the American troops now fighting desperately in the eye of the German storm would have told Bradley a different story. The hundreds of American prisoners had no chance. Many were captured before they were able to resist, overwhelmed by the German onslaught. Eisenhower disagreed with Bradley's assessment and feared a major German offensive. He ordered 2 armored divisions from neighboring formations to flank Model's assault. U.S. combat engineers helped to slow the German panzers. They created obstacles across the German line of advance and blew bridges before Model's tanks reached them. This gave Bradley's troops time to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. Meanwhile, the leading tanks of Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army advanced on Bastogne. In the meantime, Otto Skorzeny commandos were wreaking havoc. Using U.S. jeeps and trucks, they left a trail of destruction in their wake. The American solution was brutally simple. Any German caught wearing an American uniform was shot as a spy. No exceptions were made. After nearly 48 hours of fighting, Model's assault troops had been frustrated in the north and south. They were already being funneled west into a salient, the Bulge, which denied them the shortest route to the River Meuse. Most of Sepp Dietrich's battle groups had been brought to a halt. But he still had hopes that one group could achieve the elusive breakthrough. That group consisted of 100 tanks and almost 5,000 men of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division. Its leader, the 29-year-old Joachim Peiper, was a ruthless Nazi and a veteran of savage battles on the Eastern Front. Dietrich also realized it was imperative that he reach the huge U.S. fuel dumps at Stavlo so that he could replenish his panzers. Dietrich's progress would now depend on Peiper and his 70-ton Mark VII King Tiger tanks. Their 7-inch armor made them almost invulnerable. Peiper had begun his advance late on December 16th. Intent on racing for the Meuse, his battle group made good progress at first. But by the 17th, his fuel shortage prevented him from exploiting a gap in Bradley's line, which quickly disappeared. Seeking a fresh line of advance, Piper pushed his way toward the town of Malmedy. Now behind American lines, Piper ambushed a U.S. artillery observation battalion on its way to the front. The Americans who surrendered to the Germans were brutally shot. It was by no means an isolated incident. Innocent Belgian civilians, men, women, and children, were killed by the SS. Piper was determined to press on. Over the next 2 days, he attempted to force his way to the River Meuse. But he was frustrated at every turn by American combat engineers. As Piper advanced, the engineers blew up bridges and set up roadblocks. As bridge after bridge was demolished, Piper was forced onto minor roads and tracks in a desperate search for crossing points. As he did so, Piper cursed the Americans as those damned engineers. By December 20th, Battle Group Piper's days were numbered. By Christmas Eve, the unit would no longer exist. Model realized this was the last gasp for Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army north of the Bulge. But to the south, Bradley's men were fighting another crucial battle around Saint-Vith. Saint-Vith and Bastogne to the south were along key routes to the Meuse. Bradley knew that he had to hold both towns or risk a German breakthrough. Bradley now turned to Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army south of the Bulge. He ordered him to swing 3 of his divisions north to head for Bastogne. Simultaneously, on December 20th, Eisenhower placed Montgomery in command of all Allied forces on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The British 30th Corps then joined the battle to protect crossings over the Meuse. Bradley's men fought on with great skill in the defense of Saint-Vith. It fell to the Germans on December 23rd. But its garrison had bought enough time for the Allies to consolidate the northern shoulder of the salient. Model was still determined to push toward the River Meuse with Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. If Model could quickly capture Bastogne, he would have the key to unlocking Bradley's defenses. Occupied and defended by the U.S. 101st Airborne Division and a battle group of the 10th Armored Division, Bastogne would soon decide the fates of Model and Bradley. Bastogne was a key communications center in the Ardennes region of France. Omar Bradley knew that this important town, which had major road and rail junctions, could disrupt Germany's drive to the Meuse and the entire German offensive. German Field Marshal Walter Model pressed the 5th Panzer Army to take Bastogne as quickly as possible. By December 22, 1944, Bastogne had been isolated by 3 German divisions and besieged in bitter fighting which raged both day and night. The Germans asked the commander of the 14,500-strong Bastogne garrison to surrender. Anthony McAuliffe's reply was, "Nuts." He had been reassured the previous day when a brief break in the weather allowed Allied aircraft to fly in supplies. But when the main German attack began, it was almost overwhelming. Fighting raged for days. It seemed that Model's attackers were about to prevail and take Bastogne. On Christmas Day, they began their most ferocious assault and breached McAuliffe's defenses in 2 places. At one point, the commander of the 502nd Airborne Regiment asked over his field telephone where the enemy was. He was told that if he looked out his window, he would be looking down the muzzle of an .88. But the American defenders held on, and the German assault ground to a halt. On December 26th, Patton's armored spearheads driving up from the south linked up with the defenders of Bastogne. In a logistical tour de force, Patton swung most of his Third Army north and punched a gaping hole through the southern axis of Model's advance. Panzer formations now west of Bastogne were isolated, running short of fuel and vulnerable to Allied counterattacks. They were being bombarded by Bradley's artillery. Worse, the low clouds and fog that had until now protected the attackers from air attack cleared. Model's armor became sitting ducks for the Allied fighters and bombers. One American pilot reported that he had just witnessed a great slaughter. There would be more tough fighting ahead, but the Allies had regained the initiative. Bastogne had been saved. Bradley's troops had prevented a German breakthrough to the River Meuse and beyond. Eisenhower now planned simultaneous attacks from north and south to meet at the town of Houffalize and squeeze out the Bulge. Model sensed disaster and urged Hitler to allow a withdrawal, but he refused. Worse, the Führer ordered a new offensive to the south in Alsace, codenamed Operation North Wind. This was launched on January 1st, 1945. The offensive would cost Model another 25,000 casualties and ultimately fail. On the same day, the Luftwaffe mounted a massive air assault on Allied airfields in Belgium and the southern Netherlands. The Luftwaffe managed to destroy 150 Allied aircraft on the ground, but 300 German aircraft and 250 pilots were lost. Hitler had ruined his air force. Eisenhower's counteroffensive began on January 3rd with simultaneous attacks on Houffalize. By January 8th, the Allied pincers were closing in from the north and south. Model ordered the withdrawal of his remaining panzer units. On the 15th, the 2 Allied pincers met at Houffalize. Once the Allies linked up again, the Ardennes salient, or Bulge, was virtually eliminated. By the 18th, the original Allied front line was restored. In the month-long Ardennes offensive, Bradley's 12th Army Group had lost 60,000 men, 9,000 of whom were dead. 15,000 Americans had become prisoners of war. But the Germans had lost 120,000 men. 13,000 were killed and 50,000 had been captured. Hitler's last great gamble now appeared to be a desperate folly. Omar Bradley continued to command the U.S. 12th Army Group for the rest of the war. After the Ardennes battle, Bradley led his men in the steady Allied advance on the River Rhine. In March 1945, they crossed Germany's last major defensive obstacle in the West. Soon after victory in Europe, or VE Day, Eisenhower described Bradley as the ablest general the U.S. ever had. Following World War II, Omar Bradley served as a key administrator for Veterans Affairs in Washington until 1947. He was appointed Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in 1948, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs the following year. In this position, Bradley was involved in the formation of NATO and the Korean conflict. In 1950, he was made a 5-star general. After a full and happy retirement, Omar Bradley died in 1981. After the Ardennes offensive, Walter Model continued to command Army Group B and withdrew across the Rhine. But in April 1945, the remnants of his army group were trapped in the Ruhr pocket. As his troops were rounded up, he was asked to surrender by American General Matthew Ridgway. But Model chose suicide. He shot himself in the woods near Duisburg on April 21st. The Ardennes counteroffensive, or Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last great gamble. At first, it seemed that it might match the stunning Blitzkrieg victories of 1939 and 1940. But Hitler failed to grasp that the Ardennes in the winter of 1944 was much different than the early summer of 1940. Once the Allies recovered from Germany's initial blow, their overwhelming superiority doomed the German offensive to failure. For Omar Bradley, it had been a successful but hard-won experience. For Walter Model, it proved to be a desperate and ultimately disastrous clash of warriors.